in a perfect way. So I start recording
Okay, fine.
and I give you the floor. As you know, you have maximum 1 hour.
Okay, fine. Many thanks. Many thanks for your very kind invitation to be here with you and to share some thoughts about the organization of the ancient Egyptian economy, and particularly with a focus on production. I am really happy of having listened Professor Finesci intervention because it was really very inspiring. And I think he addresses very important questions about the how we should think the dynamics of ancient societies. In particular, I am very conscious that in the case of ancient Egypt, there is a very heavy burden of very misconceptions about the organization of the economy and so on. So I will try to present my opinions, my views according to several blocks dealing with a general introduction, the role of agriculture, trade, the peasant market production interaction, and so on. Just to begin, I would like to stress or to emphasize a very important point is that the our understanding of the organization of the production in ancient Egypt has suffered from several misconceptions. Perhaps some of them are rooted in on the particular ideological and academic conditions of the beginning of the 20th century and the late 19th century. According to this view, for instance, in the case of Gordon Child, he theorized how civilization emerged in particular areas of the Near East, in other areas of the world, in Mesoamerica, in China, India, and so on. And he introduced this idea of the civilizational pack, how civilization was possible thanks with a surplus of food, the importance of cities, the importance of bureaucracy, a new rationality in the organization of labor and other governmental activities, sorry, and so on. And in some cases, this idea had a very important impact on Egyptology because we Egyptologists thought that ancient Egypt should necessarily reproduce the conditions postulated by Gordon Child, which were mostly inspired by the Mesopotamian example. So we thought, for instance, that cities should have played a very important role in early Egypt, but it has been only in the last decades when we are reconsidering all this topic because these early cities do not appear in the archaeological record, and we think now that perhaps pastoralism was far more important than previously assumed in the origins of Egyptian society and in the organization of the pharaonic state. A second point is the importance of the idea of a nation state. Egypt, from the very beginning, was interpreted by the historians from the late 19th century as a precedent of modern nation states. It was considered that it was a territorial state with very clear borders, with very clear sovereignty, with a very tight control by the central power over all the regions and so on. And this model was present, for instance, in the work of some of the most influential historians who work on the early history of Egypt, particularly at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. Here in the slide, you can see the faces and some important work of two of them, Gaston Maspero and Edward Meyer. However, I think this idea should be reconsidered also in the light of the particular historical milieu in which these historians lived. In the case of Gaston Maspero, he was an historian living during the Third French Republic. It was a time of very uh, hard political division in France. So there was this idea that the only solution was a very strong state. And so in some cases, Gaston Maspero introduced in ancient Egypt, in a very anachronistic way, his ideas about how a state should be organized. taking France as a model. So this idea of a very centralized state with a powerful executive chief at the head, with a division of provinces, with a prefect or nomarchs in all of them, and so on. In the case of Edward Meyer, he also introduced some modernist ideas. He thought that the history of that there was some kind of general historical laws which reappear here and again in history. So, for instance, he was very convinced that in the early stages of Egyptian history, during the third, the second millennium before Christ, reproduced similar patterns of historical development taken from European history. This idea of the emergence of a powerful bourgeoisie at the end of the third millennium before Christ, the decentralization of the state, and so on. It would be very, very long to talk about all these kind of things, but they have left this idea in the study of the Egyptian economy that it was a very centralized, very bureaucratic, and especially the importance of redistribution was capital in the management of affairs. Here you can see also another idea is that Max Weber also thought about the organization of ancient Egypt in some of his, particularly in his famous work about the economy and the social organization of ancient states. And so he also reproduced this idea that in some cases, ancient states should reproduce this idea that there was a very strong bureaucracy, a very particular kind of rationality inspired in Western rationality, the division of the state in departments with a very clear division of tasks and administrative competences, this kind of impersonal administrative relations, effective, efficient circulation of information, and so on and so on. But in any case, he, as well as other historians of the late 19th century, he also thought that there was a difference between Oriental states and Western states that blocked, for instance, the passage to capitalism or to more modern and efficient ways of economic organization, particularly the idea of despotism and the arbitrary exercise of power, the fact that cities were mostly consumer and not producers, and the a very restricted role of markets. So I will not enter into these questions, but in any case, I think that in many cases, we have that several approaches to the study, the traditional approaches to the study of the pharaonic economy has been very influenced by this general framework dating from the late 19th century, and which is very, very slowly being questioned now at the beginning of the 21st century. And so now we think that, for instance, these ideas of a very centralized economy, a huge importance of redistribution, an all-encompassing bureaucracy, a small place for markets and private initiatives should be really reevaluated because especially the introduction of a huge amount of new archaeological data simply do not support this traditional view. And I think that there are also several new aspects that can be analyzed in the light of an intelligent combination of archaeological data and written evidence. And I think that this combination of both sets of evidence would help us understand how agriculture was organized, which was the way of trade and markets, how domestic production was organized, which was the interaction between nomad sedentary populations in the organization of productive activities and in the management of particular areas of Egypt. And I think that there are also, we can see now that some regions in Egypt were more focused on foreign trade, and that this economic focus or specialization on the long term had a very deep impact on the politics and the evolution and the dynamics of Egyptian society. Of course, there are especially some particular points that still deserve an in-depth analysis, like, for instance, the role of cities. That is one of the greatest unknowns in the study of Egyptian, Egyptian economy. In any case, I think that there is a lot of room for comparative research Very recently, there is a growing set of publications trying to integrate pre-modern economies in the debates of economic history, of world economic history. And I'm happy to see that in many cases, the contributions of ancient history can be really very important to open the debates and to open also new questions. So after this very short and too too simplistic introduction, I would like to analyze some aspects of agricultural production in ancient Egypt. Obviously, well, Egypt is considered one of the richest agricultural societies of antiquity. Its agricultural wealth was really proverbial in the ancient world, but in many cases, this analysis has been limited by several misconceptions. One of them is that is the burden of the redistributed model. This idea that the king and the Egyptian bureaucracy control every activity in Egypt. So the organization of the economy was mostly based on a redistributive system. That means that the king and the Egyptian administration collected agricultural goods through taxes and impositions of the peasant population, and then they redistributed part of this surplus to the population according to a system of rations and so on. That means that, for instance, the capacity of peasants to organize their own production, their strategies of production, and so on, were severely limited. They were mostly considered a kind of very passive fellows with little or no agency at all, and depending on the orders of the state. We must see that I can say that in part this model was focused on this biblical story of Joseph, this idea that there was a very traditional and conservative Egyptian peasantry that practically did not change until the late 19th century. For instance, it was very popular in the first travel agencies organized by the British at the late 19th century. It was said, for instance, that tourists could see scenes of biblical life in the Nile Valley. That they could see the peasants working as their forebears 4 millennia before had been also working. There is also the burden of the ancient Egyptian literature. It's a particular literature which tries to emphasize the importance of scribes when compared with other traits of Egyptian society. And so the peasants are usually depicted and interpreted as very poor people, always eager, always struggling to earn their life, living at the subsistence level, and so on. So this idea that the Egyptian peasantry was mostly a passive social group has been very, very important in Egyptology, and it is only in recent times that we are trying to reevaluate this biased idea thanks to a reanalysis of the administrative evidence, the administrative texts, and also the contribution of archaeology. And in fact, what archaeology and texts say is that under the label Egyptian peasantry, we should uh, we should understand the existence of a very diversified social group. There were wealthy peasants, for instance. There were very poor peasants that depended on institutions, and there was a kind of middle stratum of people who had opened several possibilities to organize their economic strategies. We know, for instance, thanks to a wonderful archive from the very early second millennium before Christ, that there was a man called Ekanacht. Ekanacht was a wealthy peasant. More or less, he controlled about 50 hectares of land. He had a lot of, for instance, of cows and cattle, so he could cultivate a lot of land, and his household encompassed more or less 20 people. between dependents, members of his family, and so on. And he entertained a very dense network of social relations with other people in the district where he lived. For instance, this relation was sometimes based on loans of grain. So he obtained a lot of grain. He borrowed, well, he lent some of this grain to poor neighbors, and that enabled him to become a kind of a patron, of powerful member of the local society. And we have also some evidence about these wealthy peasants living at different periods of the Egyptian history. We know that in some cases they work for institutions like temples, like the crown, the land of the crown, the states of big potentates, of big members of the central government, and so on. So they could deliver thousands of sacks of grain to these institutions, and their interests usually spread over a district. That means over several villages. So they were influential people who in some cases were integrated in the local temples. We will see later that temples were essential in the organization and in the articulation of the Egyptian society, and in particularly in the articulation of the economic activities of the people living in the countryside. So we have already this wealthy peasantry attested in the sources. Some of these peasants, as we can see here, for instance, managed to be part of the temple staff. Uh, we must bear in mind that during especially the second millennium before Christ, um, access to temples, for instance, as priests, ritualists, and so on, was only open to a very selected group of people, usually to the elite of the kingdom or to the local elite. So, in one of the most important administrative records of the late second millennium before Christ, the so-called Wilbur Papyrus, we can see a list of nearly 3,000 holders of temple and crown land, and we can see that most of them were military personnel. What you can see here in the slide as stable masters, in reality were people involved in taking care of horses and chariots used in warfare. We also see a substantial group of priests, another group of women called generally ladies, but also we can see what is usually defined in the Egyptological studies as cultivators. That means more or less independent agricultural producers. And you can see that nearly 10% of this, I do insist, these small elites working for the temples were formed by these cultivators, or by more or less wealthy peasants living in this particular area of Egypt that you can see on the right of the slide. The importance of these cultivators should be understood in the context of a very of a changing landscape that happened in this very particular sector south of modern Cairo. More or less, it's a stretch of the Nile of about 150 kilometers, and something happened there during the second millennium before Christ. In previous periods, it was a very an area with a very poor urbanism because it was usually flooded with the so it was not very really fit for sedentary activities. It was more open to especially to cattle production and so on. But during at the middle of the second millennium before Christ, this area began to be control, began to be put under cultivation. There were new settlements created there, usually with veterans of the coming from the pharaoh, from the armies of the pharaoh. And we can see that most of the new land obtained in this area of the new cultivated land was granted to local temples. These temples cultivated this land, and that enabled some sectors of the local society to become more or less affluent or wealthy, thanks to their collaboration with the temples. This was also a period in which, when we know that temples exported grain to other areas of the Levant. I should analyze this problem later. But in any case, we can see that in some cases, this this new economic developments open the way for the enrichment of at least several sectors of the Egyptian peasantry. We can see that they commercialized part of their harvests because in some cases they paid their taxes in gold and silver. We have some documents describing these payments to the state. And to give you a general idea, there is another papyrus from this period, from the very late second millennium before Christ, in which the peasants at the service of a series of temples in Egypt paid almost a ton of silver, 1,000 kilos of silver, to these temples as a particular tax. That also obviously implies that the harvest should be commercialized to get the silver, then paid to the temples, as in some cases also later collected by the state through taxes imposed also on temples. There are, however, several aspects that we don't really know, or that we can only guess more or less generally about the organization of peasant strategies. And I think that the analysis of taxes is really crucial to this point. Because obviously, when the state imposes taxes on peasants, one of the perhaps the most important tax consisted of labor, but the second one consisted apparently on grain. That means that the state is interested in a very particular kind of production, a kind of production that could be easily controlled, stored, and transported, and that means grain. But we can see that, we can see that perhaps this tax system imposed on the population of Egypt the cultivation of land. But we know that thanks to several inscriptions from different periods of Egyptian history, that when the state collapsed and the tax system collapsed too, there was a move to to more mobile lifestyles. So people, peasants and so on, prefer to diversify their economic strategies, which were then based partly on extensive cattle raising, partly on agriculture, partly on fishing and fowling, even hunting, and partly on other activities. Mobility was very important for them. They circulated across this landscape of Egypt, and in some cases, some of the officials of the administration record in the descriptions that they tried to sedentarize and to settle people again and to force them to produce for the state. But this aspect, these cycles of uh, sedentarization and to return to mobile lifestyles, in particular in some areas of Egypt, like northern Middle Egypt, the eastern, and perhaps the western delta, are for the moment very bad understood. But in any case, we can understand that the Egyptian population had several economic strategies at their disposal, and the possibilities to develop them depended finally on the coercion capacity of the state and the capacity of the state on of imposing taxes, particular types of taxes that obviously depended on a very particular type of production, like cereal production, uh, harvest who could be commercialized, and so on. That opens another aspect to analyze in the case of the production of ancient Egypt, and that means the market production. Usually, it was considered in Egyptology that market production was negligible at best. But we are accumulating more and more evidence that probably this was not the case at all, and that that this kind of exchanges outside the redistributive networks controlled by the state may have been rather important. We know, for instance, in the second half of the second millennium before Christ, that temples had fleets of boats that circulated along the Nile to collect some particular goods and to exchange them with peasants and other producers. For instance, one of the most important goods were textiles. In other cases, it was dates, because well, the date palms became very popular in the second half of the second millennium before Christ, but the working date, palm date plantations was a very strenuous and not very and very expensive activity. So institutions usually were not very interested on that. But in the case of peasants, they were very interested because it was a very intensive. Uh, well, it was a commercial harvest that could be very easily sold in markets. So in some cases, they were interested in producing this kind of goods. I will develop this idea later during my intervention. But in any case, we can see that there was this kind of interconnection between peasants and institutions. And in some cases, the sources say that the peasants were paid in silver because of their deliveries of fish, of food, wine, oil, and other kind of items. There is also increasing evidence about the implication of peasants in artisan activities. For instance, the exploration of several houses in Elephantine in southern Egypt revealed that the local population, in some cases, developed some craft activities alongside their ordinary productive activities like peasants and so on. In some cases, we can see that they were involved in the production of the transformation of semi-precious stones, for instance, to prepare necklaces and so on. In other cases, they produce small pieces of faience, then used to decorate temples and palaces and private houses at Amarna and so on. So there is a new field of research that reveals probably that the peasant production was rather more diversified than what the old historiographical models suggested. This idea of poor peasants living at the level of subsistence and with no agency at all. And this, I think, is one of the aspects I would like to stress during this lecture. The second point concerns the interaction between agricultural producers and institutions. I think that here the main impetus for the renewal of the studies of the ancient Egyptian economy comes from the parallels from Mesopotamia and elsewhere. There we can see that there was in some cases a sector of peasants who collaborated with the institutions. For instance, providing workforce is in particular periods of the year, cultivating tracts of land belonging to the temples or to the crown, and so on. That open economic opportunities, particularly for peasants having the resources necessary to cultivate this land. For instance, the necessary workforce, the necessary animal force to organize yokes of oxen and to till the land. So we can see a kind of transition between the third and the second millennium before Christ. In the third millennium before Christ, for instance, we can see that the land belonging to the temples and to other institutions apparently, apparently they were cultivated through a corvée system. That means through a system of forced labor, where the producers, usually called meret in the ancient sources, were more or less forced to cultivate the land of the temples and of the crown. But for instance, during the second millennium before Christ, we can see a more diversified pattern of production. We can see that part of the land of the institutions still was cultivated through a corvée system, but in other cases we can see that there were what we can call rural entrepreneurs. That means wealthy peasants who had the resources necessary to cultivate large tracts of land belonging to temples and other institutions. So they deliver an accorded quantity of grain to the institution, and the rest was the profit taken by the peasant. So we can see that there was a kind of more decentralized system that perhaps was necessary to put under cultivation new tracts of land belonging to temples, but these temples had their pieces of land scattered across Egypt. We know, for instance, that the big temple of Ammon at Karnak in southern Egypt had economic interests in Middle Egypt, in the Delta, even in Nubia and elsewhere. And other temples of Egypt also obeyed the same model. That means that when the land was situated very far away from the, say, the central house, the temple should turn to these rural entrepreneurs or perhaps to other temples, to other institutions to cultivate their land there. That created a very intricate pattern of cultivation that opened the possibilities for wealthy peasants to cultivate temple land and to have a good business. We can see here more or less the pattern as it can be defined thanks to the sources from the late second millennium before Christ. We have at the basis of the system what I call the Ihuti system. They were permanent peasants, apparently attached to the land. They usually cultivated a standard tract of land consisting of 20 aruras, more or less 5 hectares and a half, and they were supposed to deliver each year 200 sacks of land. The quantity depended on the quality of the land. In some cases, if the land was of poor quality, they had to deliver half this quantity of land. Then we have corvées. Corvées means that there were peasants who should work for an institution at a particular moment of the year, perhaps when it was necessary to prepare the land and to harvest and to collect the harvest. Then we have this what I call the rural businessmen or entrepreneurs who work for they had their own business. They could work according to the centralized system. They work for the temples. For instance, they could cultivate something like 100 hectares of land or 50, 100 hectares for the temples, the crown land, and so on. For the institutions, it was a very interesting system because it enabled them not to nourish and to keep all the year round a given amount of workers. They could cultivate the land through this more decentralized system. And these businessmen, we know that they could deliver, in some cases, thousands of sacks of grain coming from different localities. That means that they were real rural potentates, very influential in the local sphere. We have also fields leased to individual people. And finally, we have also that institutions granted land to some individuals as rewards or remunerations, and these people could transmit this land to their inheritors, to their descendants, or they could buy the land, but only the rights over the land, not the land itself. And it's a very important point. And we can see that the proportion between all these modalities varied depending on the political conditions over time. For instance, during the late second millennium before Christ, it was a period of imperial expansion of Egypt in the Near East. That means that perhaps as much as 100 or 200,000 workers and the different categories, slaves and so on, arrived into Egypt. And according to the Egyptian inscriptions, they were usually put to work on the fields of the institutions and to work on textile production. And so this allowed in this particular period to develop the Ihuti system. But when the imperial conquests were lost at the very end of the second millennium before Christ, there was apparently a problem with the availability of a workforce, and according to some inscriptions, it seems that part of the land of the temples was left uncultivated. So we can see that this production opened the possibility for temples to accumulate wealth, particularly in the form of silver. The question is that silver arrived in Egypt because of the commercialization of crops. And must bear in mind that in this period, probably Egypt exported huge amounts of grain into the Levant. We know that, for instance, the Hittite Empire requested Egypt to have deliveries of of grain and in exchange of payments of silver. And that perhaps may explain why the value of silver dropped down in Egypt in this period. For instance, nearly about 40%. That means that huge amounts of silver arrived then into the country, into Egypt, probably because of these exports of grain. Here you can see well some of the treasures found in the context of the temple equipment in the delta. And you can see that this silver was accumulated in the form of nice objects, ritual objects, and so on, but also in the form of hack silver. This silver employed usually in economic transactions in everyday economic operations. Uh, we can see here, for instance, that this importance of temples uh, enable to wealthy peasants to thrive in some areas of Egypt. In some cases, we have some archives that describe the opportunities opened by the commercialization of land. Well, sometimes it was mixed with some corruption affairs and so on. But in any case, this was a very important point for the organization of the agricultural production in Egypt during the late second millennium before Christ. Finally, I would like to also to show this problem about we can see that in this period silver was arrived into Egypt. It was used in everyday transactions, and so when this still not very well known economic and political crisis that affected all the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East during the very late second millennium before Christ, still silver was desperately needed. Uh, we can see that there was a process of debasement of silver across vast areas of the Near East that in some cases implied robberies in tombs, in ancient tombs, to try to get silver. Apparently, it was only during the 9th century before Christ that the supply of silver reached again all these regions, including Egypt itself. So apparently, the importance of silver circulation, of commercialization of crops, of economic integration was important enough across this vast area to imply that silver was currently used, and its absence could provoke very important political consequences in Egypt, in the Levant, and in other areas of the Near East. So that some scholars call this period a period of economic globalization, precisely because of this integration of the economies in this area. You can see here, for instance, these small hoards of hack silver found in different areas of the Levant, but you can see find them also in Egypt, especially in some areas of the Delta that became the most dynamic economic region in Egypt during the late second millennium before Christ, and particularly during the first millennium before Christ. So, how can we think about the importance of peasants and in ancient Egypt and the relation to market production? There has been some influential views, as I explained before, that say that peasants in fact had little or few agency in ancient Egypt. We must say that there has been also some trends in rural history. The focus, for instance, on the work of Shayadov and other scholars. And according to their view, peasants were more or less focused on subsistence, only to subsistence, leaving little less room for production for markets. However, other scholars like Jairus Banaji and specialists working on ancient Mesopotamia and exploiting the cuneiform archives especially from the first millennium before Christ, this evidence reveals that even small peasants could be integrated in vast networks of production for markets and for exports during the pre-modern period. For instance, in the case of Egypt, we can see women that produce textiles, but also wine, flowers, oil, fruits, and so on, that were sold to the fleets sent sometimes by traders or by institutions. One of the most important economic operations consisted in exchanges of dates for grain. Institutions were interested in having the dates, but not in cultivating dates because it was not lucrative enough for them. And so more or less the balance was of the exchange was the same as in Mesopotamia. One sack of dates for one sack of grain. Here we have some representations of markets in riverside areas, and we can see that women played a very important role. In some cases, we know that they were paid in silver, and for instance, some administrative sources from this period, like the book on the right of this slide, describe some of these operations in which people deliver textiles to these fleets belonging to traders and to institutions. Unfortunately, we cannot evaluate the importance of domestic textile production, then subsequently sold or delivered to institutions. We know, for instance, for some pieces of papyri from the late second millennium before Christ, several houses in the area of Fayum deliver textiles to the royal institutions in the area. But we unfortunately we cannot evaluate the importance or the impact of these kind of activities on the economic strategies of peasants and other population. We also have the importance of mining operations. We know, for instance, from southern Egypt, especially from Elephantine, from Middle Egypt and other areas, that small mining activities was an important activity for ordinary Egyptians. They got this material, they transferred the stones or the semi-precious stones at home, and they probably sold or delivered these goods in the form of necklace and so on. It was a kind of a small craft activity compatible with other, with the main economic activities, like for instance, agriculture and so on. We know that perhaps the extraction of gold on a seasonal basis was perhaps important enough. We are more and more aware that in some areas of the Nile Valley and outside, the interaction between Egyptians and people and desert peoples was very important. And we must have in mind that these desert peoples provided Egyptians, even ordinary Egyptians, with minerals and other products from the desert. Particularly gold and semi-precious stones were important enough to be recorded in some cases by the Egyptian authorities. So the textiles, small mining operations, small crafts, and so on, complemented the activities of the peasant population of Egypt, and probably means that there was some kind of integration of these small households into a broader market sphere, but we unfortunately we cannot evaluate the importance of the impact of these activities on the local population. We can only evaluate the importance of some technological innovations introduced during the middle of the second millennium before Christ and their impact on some productions. Here, for instance, you can see on the right the introduction of the saduf. The saduf was very important because it enabled the permanent irrigation of small plots of land. It was a very strenuous work. That means that not that only more or less wealthy peasants could afford this kind of irrigation device. And on the left, you can see an aspect that became very common in this period. In Egypt, it was the representation of gardens with several types of fruit trees. And this kind of production of fruit trees became really important in Egypt in this period. Uh, the whales were also very important, and they were very really coveted. In Egypt, there are several evidences in the archaeological and in the documentary record of the importance of wells and of the small plots of land surrounding these plots, these wells, and which were planted with high-value crops, usually oriented towards local urban markets, especially flowers, fruits, dates, vegetables, and so on. In some cases, we even know that there were some kind of intentional strategies seeking to accumulate plots of land around wells. Usually, some of these wells apparently were in the hands of private landowners, but these landowners should have access to workforce to manipulate the shaduf. For instance, a shaduf could irrigate about 200 square meters, but it requested the work of a person for 12 hours. You can see that it was really strenuous, and only more or less wealthy peasants could afford to have somebody working permanently in the manipulation of the shaduf to cultivate some pieces of land. Here, I would like to stress some agricultural innovations introduced during the second millennium before Christ, like the introduction of new species of fruit trees like pomegranate, olive tree, almond tree, and so on, the large diffusion of date palms, also the importance of flower cultivation, thanks to the use of the saduf. And what is very interesting is that there appears a new type of literary composition that celebrates um, the horticultural periphery of the cities. They describe that the cities were very rich because they were surrounded by plantations, by fields, and so on. So that means that these possibilities of irrigation enable some wealthy peasants to accumulate more wealth and to deepen their interaction with the institutions. So we can only ask several questions about the importance of the balance between this private perishable production against institutional commercial crops, where these wealthy peasants more focus on these lucrative crops sticking that were intended to be sold in markets, whereas neighbors were more interested on extensive cultivation of cereals. We can only ask this question because we don't have enough evidence. In any case,
Sorry for interrupting you. You have
yeah,
10 minutes.
10
Mm.
minutes. Okay, fine, it's perfect. So many things. So we have the other possibilities. For instance, in the case of peasants and other kind of people, we have documents from the late second millennium before Christ that describe how people also work, at least seasonally, to collect salt, honey, papyrus. That occasionally they hunted, they fished, and so on, to provide for the institutions. And we have evidence also that these activities enable even modest people to accumulate wealth. For instance, we know that at the very end of the third millennium before Christ, several cemeteries in Middle Egypt reveal the presence of small objects made of silver and gold. Um, as Egypt became more and more integrated in the international networks of trade and other economic activities from the very end of the third millennium before Christ and the early second millennium before Christ, silver arrived in Egypt, was used, for instance, in ornaments, some treasures, and so on, but also in these small objects found in private tombs. There are also other possibilities open for producers like building, transport, and so on, but I will not develop all these kind of things. What is perhaps missing in this general picture is the role played by traders. Traders are perhaps one of the most conspicuously absent social sector in ancient Egypt. We have surprisingly little evidence about them, only some glimpses here and there. that they reveal that they work for institutions, but they also, for instance, lend money or silver to peasants and so on. Uh, Curiously, it's only some foreign archives found in localities like Ebla, Ugarit, and so on that reveal the presence of Egyptian traders operating there. But unfortunately, we don't have a lot of evidence about, or significant evidence about their connection between, for instance, the institutions and the rest of the population. There is only a particular case, a set of papyri from the very late second millennium before Christ, that describe the massive robberies of tombs and temples in ancient Egypt. And we know, thanks to the list of the people, of the thieves captured, that traders were a significant part of this group of thieves because they enable to transform the precious metals into other kinds of wealth. So, for instance, in some cases, the papyri reveal that the booty was transformed, for instance, was used to buy land, to buy slaves, cattle, and so on. So the participation of traders was significant, very important to launder, finally, the booty capture. Another aspect that is very really important and crucial for a better understanding of production in ancient Egypt is the role of cities. But unfortunately, we have very little evidence. We know, for instance, the importance of the uh, planned settlements built by the crown, but with very particular purposes. For instance, for building the pyramids, to host the priestly personnel to work there, and so on. But we don't have really much more evidence. That's what it's very important to see that at the very end of the third millennium before Christ, suddenly cities increase in size and in importance. And apparently, this was a move related to the importance of increased trade along the Nile. This was a period, very curiously, it was when the state collapsed. Then suddenly cities thrived. And we can see that in some cases, well, in several cases, ordinary people boasted in their inscriptions that they had acquired ships that they traded, that they also acquired fields and so on. So this is a very particular moment in Egypt in which it seems that the cities flourished in connection with increased river trade. Of course, that happened in other periods of Egyptian history. Perhaps I'm not developing a topic about the importance of nomadic populations, the interaction between mobile peoples and settled peoples, and how this interaction was essential to, to exploit particular ecological ecotopes in Egypt and to organize productive activities like extensive cattle raising, supplies of particular items from the deserts and so on. So I would like to conclude my intervention very quickly by stressing that we have some evidence, for instance, about the importance of the economic integration of Egypt with within the Near East and the Eastern Mediterranean. So contrary to this idea of an isolated country, mostly based on subsistence agriculture and so on, we now know that Egypt was perfectly integrated in these spheres of interaction crossing the Mediterranean, the Near East, and the Northeastern Africa. That trade was very important. That we have more and more evidence about the importance of production for markets, and I think that it opens really new perspectives of research and to comparative studies with other areas of the ancient world. So many thanks for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this wonderful insight in the ancient Egyptian production. And thank you for stressing I have to, sorry, to interrupt the